I've been testing out the Laowa 25mm f0.95 prime lens for a little while now, so I thought it was time to share my findings with you. Now, the main reason people are going to be interested in this lens is its super wide aperture, so much of the test footage in this video is going to be shot wide open. However, I think it's important just to check, where does this lens sharpen up to become more of a quote-unquote conventional lens? Let's just have a look at some test footage of that now. At wide open, we can see the corners are very soft, and then it gets sharper to my eyes at f2.8, and then f4 is a good sweet spot. You can also notice that the vignetting is worse wide open, so if you don't want as much vignetting, then stop down slightly. I thought it would also be interesting, while I do have a few 25mm lenses at different apertures and different price points, to just have a little pixel peep and just see how the Laowa might compare to my Lumix and Maker lenses. For a completely unfair comparison, this is the Lumix Leica f1.4, and it's sharp across the board, which is why it's probably my favourite lens ever. Just bear in mind that because there are no electrical elements within the Laowa lens, we don't get the barrel distortion correction. So ignore the barrel distortion in these images and just look at the image quality itself, which I still think the Leica knocks its socks off, but you would expect that. And finally, a more fair comparison between the more budget-friendly Maker f2.0. I think these lenses are quite evenly matched, so I think in terms of sharpness, it's quite similar to the Maker, and if you want it to be as sharp as the Lumix, you need to stop it down to maybe f4 or so. At f0.95, of course the edges are quite soft, because it's very, very hard, if impossible, to get a lens that wide open, perfectly sharp, and if that thing did exist, it would certainly cost a heck of a lot more than this lens. But also the argument I would say is, why on earth would you need your edges to be super sharp when you are shooting wide open? Because we're using this wider aperture to isolate our subject. Hello B. You can notice quite a lot of vignetting throughout these images, which is a bit of a pain, but it's very easy to fix in post-production, and you do get less vignetting when you stop down a little bit. Wide open, the depth of field with this lens is genuinely full frame rivaling. You get such an extreme effect that you either love or hate, and I would suggest that you don't use it for the sake of it. It's a very specific look that we're going for here, so you're not going to be wanting to use it all the time. This extreme sort of shallow depth of field can either make or break an image, so if you do want to get this lens, make sure you use the effect where it's appropriate to get the best results. Here's an example of just how shallow the depth of field can be. These buttons on my camera in reality are very close together, but you can isolate them one at a time using the shallow depth of field on your focus with this lens. Let's talk about low light performance. I guess that's where a lot of people are going to be most interested in seeing the test results, and I'm very happy to report that it is very, very good, but also there are a few things that you need to be aware of in tricky lighting conditions. The colours are vibrant, it will lower your ISO, it will isolate your subject, and it will look great. However, if the lighting situation is a little bit more tricky, usually when you're shooting towards brighter streetlights, for example, you do need to watch out for some haloing effects and also some blooming and ghosting. I think every wider aperture lens I've used does suffer from this to a degree. You'd have to spend a heck of a lot of money to get this to be completely eradicated. In my findings, you can stop the lens down even to a very respectable f1.4 or 1.8 and clear up a lot of these effects. The trouble comes when you're shooting at night, you don't often get to see this phenomenon on the back of your camera because it's quite hard to spot until you're editing afterwards and it's too late. So some of these photographs were unusable due to the haloing, and I didn't notice at the time of shooting, but now I have more experience with this lens. I know next time to stop it down a little bit or just choose my angles a little bit more carefully. I think with this lens, and all lenses really, it's about having a little bit of experience with them and knowing the limitations and their strong points and their weak points, and shooting accordingly to get the best out of the equipment. One more thing to look out for: if you don't absolutely nail your focus wide open, you will get this sort of blooming and ghosting effect with your highlights. It's not a very pleasing effect and can absolutely ruin an image, and it's really down to the user to nail the focus. Now, I was using focus peaking and magnification, and sometimes just because the shallow depth of field is so shallow, you do miss focus occasionally and do get the effects like this. This can be solved again by stopping down or just making sure your focus is correct. So maybe 50% user error and 50% something to look out for if you do use this lens. Speaking of focus, the focus throw on this lens is huge. And I suppose it has to be because you've got so much depth of field to wrangle to make your images work. This is a pro and a con. It does make nailing your focus quite easier because you've got a lot more control over the nuances of the lens. But if you're trying to shoot quickly in a scenario, for instance, I shot some photographs at a hen party with this lens recently, and the changing in distance and trying to capture a moment quickly is quite hard, because to get from one end of the focal range to the other can take, you know, quite a lot of turning. So it's not maybe a lens to be used in quick fire situations, perhaps more controlled environments. For street photography, where you're mostly going to be shooting in infinity, it's not really a problem because you don't have to shift your focus too much. Likewise, the aperture ring is clickless and noiseless and very smooth, and there's a huge expanse between f0.95 and f2. So you've got like half of the ring for those wider apertures, so it's very easy to dial in what you want. And it's very easy, if you do experience some phenomenon in the pictures that you don't want, to just sort of find the sweet spot of where it goes away and keep your aperture as wide as possible. The downside of this not being clicky is sometimes when I'm using it for photography, I have found that it's so close to the camera body, I do move it slightly. Now, you don't tend to move it very far because, as I say, you're still going to be in the wider aperture zones, but it's a pain in the backside because sometimes you do have to just look down and check what aperture you're in. I do wish maybe you had the option to make it clicky or not clicky, like some of my Sigma lenses have, and just to give you a little bit more of that versatility. If I had to choose, I would probably keep it as it is because it's great for video. So what might you buy instead? Well, in the third-party range, we have the Maker lenses as a competitor. You could also go for your conventional native lenses, so your Lumix or your Olympus, and you will get your autofocus, you will get a more plasticky build quality, but you won't get that super shallow depth of field. So I think it really comes down to how much do you want your shallow depth of field? Because if you really, really want that full frame look, that very, very shallow, extreme shallow depth of field, this is a brilliant choice, and there's not very many options, certainly not at this price point, that will perform as well. And it has to be said, my experience with other third-party lenses, and I won't name names, but you probably know if you've been in the Micro Four Thirds niche for a little while. Some lenses will boast, you know, this is an f1.0 or an f0.95, but then in reality it's completely unusable until like f1.8, so you needn't have bothered. This is not the case with the Laowa. You will get really good results at f0.95, which is what you buy the lens for, presumably. It's very usable, it does what it says on the tin, and for this price point I don't think there's anything better. That being said, you do need to know the limitations of the lens and shoot accordingly. One other thing I do wish it did have was some electrical connection to the camera. Not for autofocus necessarily, but even just to transmit the metadata, because sometimes when I'm editing I would like to know what f-stop I'm at, so that perhaps if I do see something that crops up at a certain f-stop, I know next time to avoid it. So there's absolutely no connection to the camera with this lens, so you don't get any of your metadata, unfortunately. As an aside, the lens hood is super duper stiff. It made me laugh so much, I nearly sort of like, I thought I'd snapped it off and it was a fixed lens hood, but it's not, it's just stiff. So it will take filters, which is great for your video work. Just, yeah, be a bit firm with the lens hood. It needs a bit of persuasion. If you enjoyed this review, why not check out my Leica 8-18 lens review next and learn about some wide angle lenses? Why not?